South Korea has been in the spotlight for years because it's perfectly positioned where major trade routes meet in Asia. This makes it a big deal for countries like the US and China, but it also means Seoul gets caught in their tug-of-war. Both powers put pressure on South Korea to pick a side, so its leaders have to play it smart, balancing the country's needs while keeping both giants happy. The US has South Korea's back on security, with a defense treaty and troops stationed there to counter threats like North Korea. This ties South Korea's defense policies closely to US goals, like keeping the region stable. But China's a massive economic player for South Korea, and Seoul has to tread carefully to avoid ticking Beijing off, which could hit its economy hard. To manage this, South Korea keeps strong military ties with the US, supports American-led security moves, and diversifies its trade partners to not rely too much on China. The big issue here is figuring out South Korea's role in the US-China rivalry, especially as tensions rise and people worry about a new Cold War or even nuclear risks. Some researchers, like Turtugulova and Lee, say countries like South Korea, which lean democratic, feel the political heat most because of internal debates over values. But they miss a key point. South Korea's economic ties with both the US and China are just as crucial for its growth. Recent global events, like COVID wars and growing US-China clashes, have boosted China's global influence, making some think it's pushing a new Cold War. But others argue the US is also stirring the pot, and not enough research has sorted out who's driving this mess. Either way, South Korea's stuck in the middle, and understanding how it handles both countries' agendas is key to seeing where it stands. The US and China are in a major power struggle in the Indo-Pacific, and it's shaping the big conflicts in the region. China's main tool is the One Belt, One Road initiative, which uses trade and infrastructure to boost its influence, with South Korea as a key hub for shipping stuff to Europe. The US isn't a fan of this new Silk Road and warns it could cause unexpected problems for places like South Korea. Some say Seoul's take on this hasn't been studied enough since there aren't immediate disasters, but thinking ahead is key to spotting future risks. This video is unique because it mixes history, current politics, and future predictions to figure out South Korea's role in the US-China rivalry. It looks at how military, economic, and political factors shape Seoul's tough choices and shows why it's a big player globally. The goal is to nail down how South Korea fits into this competition and what it needs to do to stay stable and secure, especially with risks like a global nuclear conflict hanging over the region. The video focuses on two things: spotting the tricky parts of US-China relations for South Korea, and figuring out how Seoul balances its US security ties with its economic reliance on China. South Korea has been in a rough spot for ages, starting with China-Japan fights in the late 1800s and the Cold War, when the US and Soviet Union split Korea in two, leading to the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Those events hit South Korea hard, so now it tries to play both sides, keeping good ties with the US and China to protect itself. But with US-China tensions rising, Seoul's stuck choosing a side, which could hurt its relations with one of them. Even with disagreements, like over Taiwan or Hong Kong, the US and China still trade a ton, hitting $690 billion in 2022. The US is pushing hard to boost military ties with South Korea through things like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, started in 2007 with Australia, India, Japan, and the US. It's meant to counter China by building defense alliances, like a mini NATO. In 2022, the US's Indo-Pacific strategy aimed to limit China's influence and strengthen its own, with South Korea as a top focus. US military aid to Seoul keeps growing, and in 2023, President Yoon Suk-yeol got a G7 summit invite, showing South Korea's already in on these US-led plans. But this makes China nervous, and at home, conservatives in South Korea push for stronger US ties, while progressives want more independence and closer China relations. A big deal was the THAAD missile defense system. In 2013, South Korea asked the US about it to counter North Korea's missiles. By 2016, they set it up in Seongju County, but locals worried about radiation, so it was moved. China and Russia complained it could spy on their missiles, though China later just asked for toned-down use. By 2017, THAAD had stopped 15 North Korean missiles, showing it works. But it pissed off China, which hit back with boycotts and tourism bans, hurting South Korea's economy. This sparked debates about whether security gains were worth the economic pain, pushing Seoul to spread out its trade partners. From 2005 to 2022, U.S. military support, like funding and joint exercises, has shaped South Korea's defense policies. But it's also caused tensions with China and debates at home about balancing security and economic stability. South Korea's tight alliance with the U.S. has really shaped its policies and society, especially with the U.S.-China rivalry heating up. Teaming up more with the U.S. on military stuff has beefed up South Korea's defense, but it's come at a cost, straining its economic ties with China. This has sparked some big political and economic headaches at home, showing just how tricky South Korea's position is. Seoul's got to juggle pressures from both Washington and Beijing while looking out for its own interests. On the flip side, China's playing a different game in the region. It's pushing for countries like South Korea to stay neutral toward the U.S., using its One Belt, One Road initiative as a key tool. This is all about boosting trade, infrastructure, and financial ties to spread China's influence without picking fights with the U.S. Instead of forming anti-American groups, China focuses on independent economic and political moves. Since the mid-2000s, Beijing's been cozying up to South Korea, hunting for investors and business partners to strengthen ties through this initiative. By 2020, this was a big focus. Chinese financial companies visited Seoul to build closer connections, and China's ambassador, Xing Haiming, praised South Korea's leadership, urging its businesses to invest in China to boost Seoul's global business rep. Unlike the U.S., which pushes military alliances, China in 2019 invited South Korea to join its global data security initiative, arguing that U.S. sanctions on Chinese tech hurt both China and South Korea, its close economic partner. In 2021, at the ASEAN Summit, South Korea signed on to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a big free trade deal. Analysts say it'll boost South Korea's economy by about 0.4 to 0.5% through 2031. But trade with China has been dropping lately, partly because South Korea is starting to trade more with the US and Europe. China's pushing hard to keep South Korea as a key partner through its One Belt, One Road plan, which focuses on building infrastructure, investments, and business ties. This trade relationship shapes South Korea's policies at home, especially since it needs good economic conditions to attract Chinese investment. Being part of the RCEP deal sweetens the deal with China, but relying too much on Beijing's risky, trade between them has gone up and down due to politics and global tensions. That's why South Korea is trying to diversify its trade partners to avoid being too dependent on China. China also wants South Korea's support on tricky issues like Taiwan and Hong Kong, where it's got ongoing disputes. Seoul's backing would mean a lot for China on the world stage. But China's not happy about South Korea getting cozy with the Quad, a US-led security group with Australia, India, and Japan. China's ambassador, Xing Haiming, warned that these kinds of alliances could mess up security across Asia, maybe even sparking a new Cold War or worse, actual fighting. With global tensions rising, splitting countries into opposing camps could lead to serious trouble down the road. South Korea's caught in the middle, trying to keep its security ties with the US strong while managing economic relations with China. The Quad's a sore spot. China sees it as a threat, so Seoul's got to be careful not to rile Beijing while navigating these regional security setups. South Korea's stuck in a tough spot with the US and China, pulling it in different directions, and this is causing big debates at home. Conservatives, like those in the Power of the People Party, want to strengthen military ties with the US to keep North Korea in check. Progressives, though, are pushing for more trade and economic ties with China, aiming for a more independent path. China's One Belt, One Road project and other soft power moves, like boosting trade and cultural connections, have a huge impact on South Korea's policies and society. These efforts bring economic benefits and closer ties, but they also make South Korea vulnerable if relations with China sour. Balancing these economic gains with security needs is tricky, and the divide between conservative and progressive views makes it even harder. It's a classic case of outside pressures clashing with what's happening inside the country. China's approach is to gently nudge South Korea toward trade and cultural ties with Beijing, pulling focus away from getting too cozy with the US. They're betting that long-term economic and cultural connections will pay off big time. South Korea has been grappling with this since the early 2000s, when US-China tensions ramped up, especially after Xi Jinping took over and China's influence in Asia grew stronger, while the US's hold weakened. This shift forced Seoul to rethink how it deals with both powers in a changing world. History and tradition play a big role in these choices, whether to align with the democratic West or lean toward the authoritarian East. Conservatives push hard for US ties and strict control over North Korea, while progressives want to focus on regional ties, especially with China, and open talks with North Korea. These clashing views have sparked some tense moments. For example, President Roh Moo-hyun, 2003 to 2008, leaned toward an independent regional policy, which split his government. President Lee Myung-bak, 2008 to 2012, went all in on US cooperation, which stirred up trouble at home and hurt ties with China. Polls show most South Koreans prefer the US as their main partner. When Park Geun-hye became president in 2012, she tried to play both sides. She visited Beijing early on and stood by Xi Jinping at events, which worried the US, but she didn't ditch Washington. South Korea rolled out the THAAD missile defense system in 2016, which upset China and strained relations. When Trump took office in 2016, US-China trade disputes got worse, and Park worked to calm things down, limiting THAAD expansion and avoiding a US-Japan defense pact. This helped ease tensions with North Korea, kept US ties solid, and got things back on track with China. But in 2019, when the US and North Korea couldn't agree on nuclear limits and sanctions kicked in, China backed North Korea and threatened retaliation, putting South Korea back in a tough spot despite its efforts to stay neutral. The Biden administration tried to boost ties with Seoul, but US-China tensions made it hard to fully protect South Korea from North Korea's moves, which China supports. From 2020, the US pushed to include South Korea in the Quad Security Group, but President Moon Jae-in wasn't keen, focusing instead on better ties with North Korea, partly through China. It wasn't until late 2021 that Seoul quietly started joining Quad efforts, showing how carefully it's trying to balance both sides. Yoon Suk-yeol, who came to power in mid-2022, continues the policy started by Lee Myung-bak in 2008, aimed at a general rapprochement with Washington. However, given the new geopolitical circumstances, wars on the continent, intensified Sino-American confrontation, it will be extremely difficult for Seoul to adhere to an even policy of interaction with Washington and Beijing. It still has to make a choice in favor of one or the other state. Summarizing the current trends in Sino-American relations and defining the role and place of South Korea in them, it is worth emphasizing the following points that characterize the current situation. It is extremely important for Seoul to decide on the main vector of its foreign policy, whether to seek an even closer military and defense rapprochement with the United States, or to further strengthen trade, economic, and financial relations with China. The challenges of the modern world and emerging threats make it almost impossible to maneuver between opposing centers of power. For both Washington and Beijing, South Korea is a central partner in the Indo-Pacific region. Due to its favorable geographical location at the crossroads of many sea and land routes, South Korea is a crucial and irreplaceable element of the logistical system for the two states. The United States sees South Korea as a key partner in the upcoming confrontation with China, where the territory of the Korean Peninsula, particularly its southern part, will be used as a springboard to influence China. China sees South Korea as a valuable and most favorable trade and economic partner in terms of investment, business, and the development of high-tech enterprises and industries. Through rapprochement with Seoul, Beijing plans to technologically absorb less developed countries in the region. When analyzing the threat posed by North Korea, both American and Chinese politicians agree that it is virtually impossible to control the DPRK's actions without South Korea's participation. The policy of rapprochement between the two countries of the Korean Peninsula pursued by some South Korean presidents will help to neutralize the North Korean threat to some extent and use the situation to their advantage both for Washington and Beijing.